This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence, and in this series, we are exploring coaching outdoors and how being outdoors is good, if not vital, for our well-being. I'm talking to thought leaders and individuals who share their passion for coaching as they share their philosophy, research and practices with you. Our aim is to inspire you to unlock the potential of coaching when combined with being in nature and outdoors. Welcome to this episode in our series on coaching outdoors. Today I have with me a very special guest, Jackee Holder. Jackee is a leadership coach, coach supervisor and facilitator who specialises in working with people outdoors in an urban environment and around her home in South London. She is the author and creator of Writing with Fabulous Trees, the Urban Forest Writing Maps, and the Inner and Outer Nature Self-Discovery Card Deck. And Jackee has been featured in several anthologies, including 101 Coaching Supervision Techniques and the Big Book of Journaling. In today's episode, we're going to explore coaching in the urban environment, as well as Jackee's lifelong connection to nature. You're really going to enjoy this episode as we talk about morning rituals, weather metaphors, journaling, and supervision in nature. We also discuss the need for greater diversity in nature therapy and coaching. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today, Jackee Holder. So Jackee, a very warm welcome to the podcast today.
Morning, Rob. Great to be here. Really looking forward to talking to you this morning.
Yeah, me too, Jackee. It's been a little while in preparation, just trying to get organised, but I'm really glad we're here today and about to have this conversation. So let's start here. I'm curious as to your connection to the great outdoors and nature. Tell me what that means to you and what the background is from your point of view there, Jackee.
I think I'll start with a very pivotal moment in my life where I was in my mid-30s. I had a busy career, young daughter. I lived in South London and I started to run around my local park. And it was as a result of running around my local park every single morning that it was almost a way of balancing a lot of emotional turbulence that I was kind of experiencing at the time. But at the end of every run, I would always end up under this huge, sprawling, evergreen oak tree that sat at the top of a very small hill in that park. And that literally became my morning ritual. I knew that when I finished my run that I would kind of settle there and I would just take a few minutes to do some deep breathing. At the time, I was going through my training as a interfaith minister. So I would sometimes do what we call body prayers, which is like a non-secular prayer, but using the body, like really appreciating the earth. So that became my practice. And I started to develop a sort of like an intimacy, a connection with this tree where I just felt really safe and calm and seen and heard, because sometimes I would write in my notebook, sometimes I would speak openly and aloud to the tree. So in the end, I named the tree and I called her Sanctuary because that's what it began to feel like. I think it's Alice Walker has this very lovely quote where she says, she learned to go to church in nature. And that's suddenly what it felt like for me, that I began worshipping the trees and the trees became my sanctuary. So that moment in nature, I feel like really rooted me back into my own connection from nature, which comes from my childhood, when I would run around in the fields behind my house. In the city, London, well, on the suburbs a little bit, but we had a huge acres of playing fields behind our house, which we could access through our back garden. And I would lose myself there as a child. And I remember those being some really, really happy moments. So I feel Sanctuary reconnected me to my love of nature.
What a wonderful introduction into our conversation today, Jackee. I mean, that's a lovely frame and it's a wonderful image for me to imagine that and some of those very unique experiences to you. But what you also speak to there, what I'm hearing is there's a number of themes that you're talking to there that have come up in the series so far. And this relationship to nature that we have and a relationship to specific aspects of nature almost a daily routine with the same tree in your situation, which I find absolutely fascinating. And I love this idea of nature being a church or a place of sanctuary that people come back to, or someone can individually come back to. But I'm really curious today to talk about your experience, not just your unique experience, which I'm fascinated by, but also your experience working with others, and particularly in urban environments. Because I think something we haven't touched upon a great deal yet in this series is, how does this all show up in the city, in an urban environment, which is where a lot of the population is?
Well, first of all, let me locate myself. I was born in South London. I still live in South London. So I've lived in London all of my life. But I grew up in a place called West Norwood. And West Norwood was once part of what is known as the Great North Wood. So all around me in the names of places, West Norwood, South Norwood, Honour Oak, oak trees, Crystal Palace, Beckenham, Penge. These are all names that are associated with when the land where all the houses and residences are now was once open land, woodlands, fields, farmlands. So I feel like just growing up in West Norwood and being in the city, because I was a very curious child, I was very inquisitive. I used to sit and pore over the books that were about the history of West Norwood. And I would see all of these places. And so for me, it's a reminder that the city was once full of nature. And of course, living in London, I think London's got over 13 million trees. At least 6 million of those trees are oak trees, which I find absolutely fascinating. And London has, oh my God, over, I think it's 300 parks, which is quite phenomenal. And in the UK as a whole is full of still got pockets of ancient woodlands, and is just a country full of nature. So for me, the urban city, what I've discovered for over 35 years of walking, I've walked a lot around the city. And what I used to do was I used to walk from my home to a park. First of all, I used to run. As I've gotten older now, I walk. But I've got to see a lot of the city. And what I love about London, it is a city alive with nature. And it was that lived experience of feeling that this city feeds my nature fix. And that often people associate inner city environments with not having a lot of nature. And my experience has been completely different. I find that I'm constantly being confronted with nature, whether I go on a walk, whether it's through the flowers I walk past, the plants I come into contact with. During lockdown, I lived near to what is known as South Norwood Lakes. It's a beautiful lake in the middle of the city. I used to walk around that every morning. And during lockdown, I got to know so many different people that I hadn't seen for years. Because we were locked down and that was the closest place that they could get to, we would see each other on our walks. And it's just a beautiful space. It's like going to the Lake District, apart from the fact it's blue space in the city. And it's that connection that I wanted people to have with what's on their own doorstep. I want people to know that you do not have to pack your bags, go and stay in the countryside, get away to the seaside. I want people to be resourced with the nature that is on their doorstep. So that's how, for me, this relationship with the inner city. And then, of course, I got to know trees all around the city from my runs and my walks. And it was that relationship with the pine trees, with the huge plane trees that flank the embankments and along the river at Battersea and Chelsea. It was that relationship with the trees that I just feel like London is a city of trees. And I feel connected to the city and its people through its trees. There's a diversity in the trees that is a reflection of a diversity in the city. So it was bringing all of those things together, Rob, and helping people locate themselves in their environment. So I really wanted to connect. I hope I've answered the question, actually.
You really have, yeah. You've inspired me there. My next visit to London, I think the first thing I'm going to notice is the trees. And to your point here, I love that phrase that it's a city that's alive with nature. And I think it's easy, certainly for me, somebody who lives outside of the city, to imagine the city to just be a built-up urban area. But I do know from pictures that I see of the city, particularly aerial pictures, I'm always fascinated and amazed how green it is. When you fly over the city, I'm always inspired about actually there's a lot more green than there is concrete. I'm really curious here to how you introduce people to that when you work with them, Jackee.
Yeah, great question. Do you know the way I just talked about the trees? One of the things that I began to notice in my work as a coach was whenever I talked about nature, say we're doing a session on leadership and we're doing a session on well-being, self-care. When I start to use examples from my own life, because my time with the trees was really around coming home to myself and my own well-being, my own self-care and mental health as well. But whenever I speak to groups, no matter where they are in terms of their roles, their positions, their seniority, if I mention trees, I get people's attention. All of a sudden, it's almost as if everybody has a story about a tree somewhere in their lifeline, somewhere on that landscape. They can run along the lifeline of their life and they can think of a tree that was either a tree that they like to look at, a tree they like to go to, a tree that has a positive memory. And I found that that was a way that I was able to engage people to talk about their connections with nature, the places in nature that energizes them. So I started to get people to talk about their favorite tree. And in getting them to talk about their favorite trees, they would tell me things about that tree that were the things about themselves. So I found out there was one coaching client that I coached in a university. And every time I used to go into her office, there was a beautiful acacia tree outside of her office window. She was quite high up, so we had that kind of splendid view of all of the upper branches of the tree. And we would literally start each session with her looking out at the tree, telling me what she was seeing in the tree. You know, was the tree bare? Was it full of flowers? Was it in leaf fall? And she would literally map that against how she was arriving in the session. And that came out of a natural conversation of us just looking out the window. She said, you know, I love that tree. And then me just listening, just kind of keeping quiet and just listening as she talked about the tree, and then using that as a way into the session. So I get people to write about trees. I get people to tell their stories about the trees. Rob, there have been some amazing stories that people have told me about trees that they've left in their homeland, trees in their back garden, trees that they go to if they want to cry a silent tear where they don't want anyone to see them. And what I found is it's a really great way of getting people to be authentic and to be honest and to be real about their internal world, their emotions, through using what Jilly Bolton describes as using metaphor. That's the thing about nature. It's full of metaphor. Jilly Bolton describes metaphor as a strategy that humans use to make sense of anything or everything which is otherwise difficult to grasp or communicate. And that's what I found when I get people to share their narrative, to share their stories through the connections with nature, is that they can talk about difficult things through the metaphors, because nature is so full of metaphors, from letting go, from being in full bloom, to being rooted, to being grounded, to windy. The metaphors, we can use them literally for our own internal weather forecast. And that's another way that I get people to talk about or use nature, is I get people to describe the weather outside their window. So I say, you bring in the senses. Tell me what colour the sky is. Tell me what colours you see. What do you smell? What's the temperature like? And I really get them to unravel the weather forecast, but by bringing in the senses. So they're bringing in more of themselves. They're getting more present to the moment, to the atmosphere, to what they're noticing outside of themselves. Then once they've done that, and I literally get them to write that down. I do that at the beginning of a coaching session. I do that at the beginning of supervision groups. I do that with groups as well. And then I invite them to then turn the camera inside themselves. And I invite them to use the metaphor of the weather and get them to write about their own internal weather forecast. And it's amazing what people reveal. And they would not say that if you ask them that question directly. They wouldn't tell you about the windy or the stormy weather that they're feeling inside of themselves. But nature almost gives them permission to be free with the language and the way they express themselves that is non-threatening. Nature is a great equalizer. A lot of the research shows that when we're out in nature, we are friendlier towards each other. Areas that have more trees, there's less violence, there's less crime. Think about that. Areas with more trees are friendlier neighborhoods to live in and co-live in. So I think there's so much there. I really like to use nature in that way as a resource, as a coach and a coach supervisor.
Yeah, we'll come back to the supervision part in a moment, because I'm keen to explore that with you too. But there's just so much in here, Jackee, that we could explore. And you're revealing to me a number of different things. I think the two key themes for me, to your point there about metaphors, is even I'm surprised. I'm reflecting as you're speaking about how often I use metaphors with people. And I realize I've just come off a coaching conversation with somebody, and we were talking about the river and the riverbanks and using that as a way of describing boundaries, discipline, and the water being creativity. And lakes, mountains come up all the time in conversation for me from a metaphorical point of view. So I love this, how you're encouraging and working with people. So I think metaphors is one thing. The other thing closely related to that, that's standing out for me, Jackee, as you're speaking there, is about language and the words that we use. And perhaps a third thing that's jumping into my mind is what you were saying about how much safer people feel. Perhaps, if that's what you're saying, in nature, they're friendlier, there's less conflict, perhaps, when more trees are around. I'm really curious to learn more about that experience that you have with people out in nature. I mean, how do people present themselves to you, and how do you then encourage them? I don't know what that's like, whether that's a challenging thing or whether that's really easy for you, Jackee, in terms of how do you frame it, and how do you, without getting into too much of the theory in detail on the contracting side of things, but how do you set up the coaching relationship with those that you work with, Jackee?
I often find that I start with nature inside the coaching room. So I listen into people's lived experiences. So, for example, I worked for the last 4 years on an on-demand coaching service for GPs. It was a really complex assignment. It was very deep in terms of the material that was presented. But at the heart of the work that I was doing with GPs was really around their well-being and their self-care. So I was always leaning in to hear about where are the places outside of the work environment where they felt resourced. And ultimately, one GP will tell me about their greenhouse that they hadn't been in for 6 months. Another would tell me that they used to be a long distance runner. So being up in the hills and on the moors was the place where they felt that they could come back to themselves. So for me, coaching around nature doesn't necessarily mean that you have to start outdoors in nature, but I would really start to harvest people's lived experiences around nature and then invite them to build that relationship with nature so they'd come back. I remember the GP coming back and telling me about the flowers that she repotted and what that felt like to have her hands, her fingers back in the earth in her greenhouse and having the sun coming in on her, and how that helped her feel renewed and re-energized for some real difficulties that she was experiencing in her family system. That's nature working for her. So I'm listening in right there, in that coaching session, sometimes I bring nature-inspired prompts into the coaching conversation. So sometimes a coachee might present something that's really complex, and I don't want to be the expert. I might have some thoughts and some reflections around what they could do, but my job is to really help them to connect with their own internal wisdom. I think about their inner wise self, or their inner mentor, or their inner coach. So I created a card deck. It's a self-discovery card deck called the Inner and Outer Nature card deck. And that came out of working with groups where I would bring in all these different metaphors around nature and get them to use these questions and these prompts on themselves. It was for a workshop that we used to run on some retreats, and it's still ongoing, actually. It was called Looking for Answers in Different Places. So we would use nature as a place where people could find answers to questions that they've been asking themselves, but they were asking themselves those questions using the same kind of questions and just getting the same answers. But we found when we used questions that were inspired from nature, that they found that they were just such richer, more generative connections that they were making. And that's how this Inner and Outer Nature deck was originated from. It was through that work that I was doing with women on those sessions. They said to me, Jackee, you've got to create a card deck from this. So I use these questions now when I'm working with leaders. And I have to tell you, Rob, the question in the deck that before I've even finished asking the question, it's almost like people's heads are down. When they're bringing a complex question, a weighty issue, I simply pull out this question: what would the wise ancient tree have to say to you about your current challenge, problem, or opportunity? And I simply get them to write for 3 to 4 minutes. Sometimes, say we're on Zoom, I'll just look and the 4 minutes is up and the person is still writing. So I'll just let them come to their natural pause, and then I'll just lean back. There'll be that space, and they will just enter that space, and they will speak words to themselves that helps them untangle that issue, make meaning of that issue, and decide what they're going to do next. And that, to me, is the power of nature, whether you're using it inside a coaching session or whether you're using it outside of a coaching session. And just to say, what I've often found is that it's when I'm working with clients that I have a much longer established coaching relationship or supervision relationship that we often go out and meet in nature. So I can remember one particular client. I've been working with her for over 6 years now, and I've written about this, and she's given me permission to talk about this. So it's been written about, it's in a chapter in a book, and it's in an article as well. One day we met in Kew Gardens. It was a beautiful day. We met up in the cafe. We did a bit of supervision and reflection in the cafe. So it was a lovely way of grounding ourselves, resourcing ourselves with some food and some tea. And then we mapped out, how does she want to spend her time in nature? Now, I must say that I know Kew Gardens really well. I've got a yearly annual card. So I know spaces where there's not a lot of people. I know where the right benches are. I know where there are particular trees or particular flowers or particular smells. So it's really important that we do get to know an area that we're going to take a coachee into, because you've got to be prepared for all kinds of weather. We live in the UK. Come on, Rob. We've got to be prepared for all kinds of weather. And so she said to me that she wanted to do some thinking about her writing, a newsletter that she wanted to create, and she wanted to do some drawing. So we walked, and I was kind of heading in a particular direction, but I was also open enough to trust that she would spot somewhere that she wanted to stop. So I wasn't leading, I was following, but I kind of knew where I was. So we walked, and suddenly we came up in front of, it was a huge plane tree. I'm thinking about the leaves of the tree. And she said, Jackee, I'm going to stay here. I like it here. There was a fallen log, and she sat on that log And she must have sat there for about 50 minutes. And I was sat not right in front of her, but a few feet away on a bench, out of her vision, but close by. When she'd finished, she came back together and she talked me through what she'd written and what she had drawn. And then almost sort of, I kind of allow the earth to speak to me. Because I was underneath this huge plane tree, I literally had plucked off 2 leaves from the tree, asked the tree's permission first. I plucked these 2 leaves off and I offered them to the client. I said, look, this feels like it's a page. And she said, you know what, I'm going to write on the leaf. And she wrote her wishes for herself on the leaf of the plane tree. And if you've never done this before, plane tree leaves they're bigger than your fists. They're as wide as your hand and your fingers, and they've got like 6 different stems to them, and there's lots of room to write on them. And they're really good under the pen. They're nice and soft. They're not crisp. They don't crunch up. They actually have a really lovely writing surface. And because I'd written on a plane tree leaf before, I was able to offer that to her. And it was a really wonderful way of us being really creative and innovative in the session. And she's gone on to write the most amazing newsletter. She's been doing it for over 3 years now. Every month it drops in my inbox. I actually clear space in my day to read her newsletter. It's so heartwarming. She's an amazing coach and therapist, and she's doing some wonderful work with women leaders. And I think a pivotal moment was out there in Kew Gardens in that session. So those are some of the ways in which I engage with nature inside of the coaching room and outside of the coaching room.
Again, Jackee, there's just so much in there to lean into, and mindful of our time here together today. But I love that example, and I'm always fascinated about what I might learn from a conversation in this way. And I never knew you could write on plane leaves, which I'm very familiar with. So I'm going to explore that, absolutely. But there were a number of things there which I was really inspired by, particularly the ways that you bring journaling. I know you're a big fan of journaling, as am I. So I'm acknowledging my own biases here. But the way that you're bringing journaling into conversations and with nature. And I love this idea of introducing the idea of nature, but not necessarily actually at the point where you have to be outdoors to begin with. So it could be in the room. And again, coming back to these sort of metaphors. And yeah, there's just so many different ways that we can actually make a connection or relate to nature. We are nature. That's something that's definitely come up in the series so far. And this idea that actually it feels natural and intuitive to us. We've all got some experience with nature that we can draw upon in a coaching relationship. So one of the other things that stood out for me was this idea that the preparation that you do. And I love how, in many respects, I'm thinking now about the preparation that you do in terms of your familiarity with the surroundings, or perhaps the structure or framework that you're going to offer or introduce to somebody you're coaching with. And yet at the same time, that in itself allowing for lots of possibility for, to your point, innovation, creativity. It's anyone's guess what's going to come up in that structure. You mentioned supervision earlier. So I'm curious as to what your relationship is to coaching supervision, and also how there's a relationship here in what we're talking about, which is coaching outdoors, but also nature, and what the relationship is there from a supervision perspective. I'm sure there's lots of coaches listening to this interested in that connection too, Jackee.
I do find that really bringing in nature into supervision can be so generative for supervisees, for very much the similar kinds of reasons that I've mentioned with how I work with coachees. But I want to give you a particular example because it is so well researched now in terms of the feedback that I'm getting around one of the particular tools that supervisors have been finding really helpful to use with their supervisees. When I wrote my book, 49 Ways to Write Yourself Well, one of the tools that I added in that resource book was a tool called Walking Through the Labyrinth, or Writing Through the Labyrinth. And the idea came from my own lived experience of walking a labyrinth out in chaos I think I might have been in New Mexico many, many years ago. I was on retreat and there was a beautiful labyrinth that I walked on this top of this very small hillside. And I remember it being a really hot day and walking the labyrinth and just feeling how sacred and insightful and resourcing walking was. We know that when we walk, it changes our connection to our creativity. It puts us in a better mood. And the idea of labyrinths is that they are a mindfulness practice. You're walking in order to gain insights, to have a better view, to see more, to experience more, to connect from the outside to the inside. And I wanted to find a way of bringing that outside experience of walking labyrinths. There's another labyrinth that I walk in Glastonbury at one of the retreat centres there. That's the first thing I go to when I go there. But I wanted to bring that and give people a bit of an experience of that. So I created this tool called Writing Through the Labyrinth, where it's an image of a labyrinth on an A4 sheet of paper. You've got one side where you start with walking into the labyrinth, and then you've got the same image on the other side of the A4 paper where you're walking out of the labyrinth. So what happens is a supervisee can bring a problem or an issue. You could do this as in group supervision or you can do it in one-to-one supervision. And this is what has been reflected back to me from supervisors that used it in groups and in individual supervision as well. You introduce the tool and you get the supervisee to write the problem into the labyrinth, literally writing out their problem in as much detail as they can along the path of the labyrinth. And they're literally twisting and turning the page as if they're walking the labyrinth. And the idea is it gives the person space to download the problem and literally have a metaphorical walk along the page, kind of laying out the issue. And when they feel they've exhausted writing about the issue, they literally just continue the line and they trace the line all through the paths of the labyrinth until they arrive in the middle. And then they pause and they just have a moment for reflection. The supervisors could get them to do some writing. They could say what they've noticed about just doing that exercise. And then after they've had a moment of contemplation, just give as long as they need, you invite them to then turn the page over. And now they've got the labyrinth, but this time they're starting the writing from the center of the labyrinth. And now they are going to write down as many ideas and thoughts about different ways that they could respond to this issue. And they literally write until they've exhausted all the ideas that have flooded into their thoughts. And then they finish by tracing the line and they arrive right back at the entrance of the labyrinth. Now, the reason I'm sharing this one is because when I've worked with groups and I've used the writing with labyrinth through the labyrinth with a lot of groups, it takes a bit of time. So you need at least 10 to 15 minutes to do it. And I'm always finding myself quite hesitant. Should I do it? Shan't I do it? Rob, every time I have shared that exercise, people have said to me, oh my God, I didn't expect that I would get so much out of this exercise. Actually, I found it so helpful to write out the problem. And then what came when I turned it over, every time I introduce this exercise, that's the feedback that I get. It's been documented in several supervision books because supervisors have taken the feedback from their supervisees and said this gets people to think outside of the box. It puts them into a space of coming up. You know, neuroscience loves novelty. And that's what I think is really good about presenting an exercise like this to a supervisee, to leaders, allowing supervisees to then take this resource to present to their coaches or their supervisees. And that's one of the ways in which I find that creative, reflective writing tools, expressive writing, journal coaching, journal writing, these are all ways that we can make supervision and linking it back to nature. There's a connection here. People that aren't getting to walk are being encouraged to walk on the page. I find that it's such a rich resource for supervision. And, I'm continually using these tools with supervisees.
What springs to my mind is I love this idea of the concept of a labyrinth, and labyrinths show up in nature all the time. Just reflecting on my own experience, walking through woods, for example, or just being the map of the territory and just following your way around, even around a town, is a labyrinth in many respects. And already in this series, one of the things that's come up when working with people, either on the page or out in the world, is this idea of getting to a junction and then making a decision, and how that can be, to your earlier point about metaphors, how does that relate to with what we're talking about here, or the subject matter of what we're perhaps coaching together on, Jackee?
Can I just add a point there that you've just made, which with a labyrinth, it's different to a maze. You can't get lost in a labyrinth. There's a way in and there's a way out. And we're using that metaphorically for thinking about challenges and problems. So I think that's a really important point about the labyrinth, that there's a way in and there's always a way out.
That is a really important point. I'm glad you've shared that with us, Jackee. Thank you for that. I'm conscious of our time today. There's still so many questions I'd love to ask you, Jackee, but I think a really important one that I'd like to ask you, because you've got a very unique perspective with your life experience. And I don't feel it's going to be something we're going to be able to cover in great detail in this series, but it's such an important point, I don't want to glance over it, is in terms of sort of cultural differences and working with cultural differences and biases, not just in coaching, but in particular with coaching outdoors and coaching with nature. What do we need to be thinking about along those lines, Jackee?
Well, I'm going to say that for me, I've walked a lot. I've done thousands and thousands of miles of walking in the city. And I often find myself walking in areas and neighbourhoods where I am in a minority. An example of that is before lockdown, at least 10 years before lockdown, I have been walking the Thames path, the River Thames, the path that runs from Battersea all the way up to Teddington Lock, Richmond Park, right up to the upper edges of the River Thames. And before lockdown, I would literally only see somebody of my colour walking along the Thames path. It wasn't a path that was frequented by a diverse community. Lockdown has changed that a little bit because people became much more aware of what was around them. Yeah, so a lot more people are walking along that path. So we know that sometimes our lived experiences can be so different depending on our culture, our upbringing, where we live. For example, once I was walking through Wandsworth Park. It's literally is along the banks of a part of the River Thames in Wandsworth, and someone told me to get out of the park. So you have to be aware of the environment, the neighbourhood, where you're taking people. Do you feel comfortable there? What part of the city are you in? I think these are things to ask yourself questions about. And I think it's really important as well, because I find that in the world of nature therapy, talking about nature, even though we're getting more and more books written by Black and brown people, you've got books like Soil by Camille T. Dungy, you've got Unearthed by Claire Ratian, you've got Uprooting by Marshall Farrell. Those are some of the ones that I know are definitely by women of colour. Nature work is still very dominated, and really it needs to be more expansive in terms of being more reflective of a more diverse population and community. And I kind of will leave you with a story of something that happened to me not so long ago, because I think it just helps us to really think about where elements of race, culture, diversity comes into this work. I went to a book reading by a very well-known author who's written a lovely book about trees. I actually got to know the author through Instagram, so I definitely knew where I was going, and I definitely was invited, and I definitely was in the right place. But I walked into the book reading. It had literally just started. Everyone was comfortably seated. I saw a seat, so I went straight to that seat, settled myself in, and someone came up to me, knocked me on my shoulders and said to me, "Oh, this is a book reading about trees. Are you in the right place?" Literally said that to me. And I'm using that as an example because I think it's really important that we think about that Sometimes we take it for granted that there are only certain communities and certain populations that have a love of nature, have a lived experience of nature. If I think about my family, my friends, coming from the Caribbean, coming from Africa, coming from Asia, those populations that are diverse, they have so much real lived experience of nature. They were close to the land. So I really want us to kind of educate ourselves and to explore and to read and to get to know neighbourhoods. London is becoming quite a split capital city in terms of who gets clean air, whose roads are blocked off, who gets the most trees planted in their neighbourhoods, whose parks are well looked after. I think this is all part of the same question. So I didn't want to leave without having that as part of our conversation, because I think it's something that we need to be really mindful of and be aware of as well.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Jackee. There's plenty there for us to just begin to start to think about in terms of what we can be doing in terms of bridging some of those gaps and sort of being more mindful of those contexts that you described there. I'm really grateful for your time today. So I want to ask you about some of the resources. You mentioned a few books there, but before I do that, I want to ask you, is there anything that you feel we haven't touched upon today that's super important that you would like to share with our listener?
Yeah. So Robert Macfarlane has written loads of books on nature, and I love his work. And there are two quotes that are prompts that I continually use with myself and with groups that have had such a significant impact on me and my life. And they're questions that I continually ask of myself. And he really framed this in the context of being out on the earth, being in front of a tree, and being able to ask these questions of the landscape. And I would love to share these questions because they mean so much to me. The first question, he says that you should ask of any given landscape, or I would add a tree or a plant or a flower, is what do I know in this place that I know nowhere else? What do I know in this place that I know nowhere else? And then the next question, which is the one I think he actually does start with, he says, what does this place know of me that I cannot know myself? What does this place know of me that I cannot know myself? The first time, about maybe 5 years ago, I came across this quote in a book I was reading. It sent shivers down my spine because that was my experience. You know, that listening to myself, listening to my clients, listening to groups, I think that there are things that nature knows about us that we don't always know about ourselves. And my mission is to open us up to finding ways that we can connect with that inner wisdom through nature being a very generous and abundant friend to us. And Rob, is it okay? I'd love to end with this quote by Rue Mapp because I think it really sums up this whole concept of nature being just the greatest equalizer. Rue Mapp is the founder of Outdoor Afro, taking more African-American peoples out on hikes and trails. And again, this was one of those quotes that just took my breath away. She says, the trees don't know what color I am. The birds don't know what gender is. The flowers don't know how much money I have in my bank account. I think we can rely on nature to be the equalizer for us so we can shed that weight. I think this quote sums up my 30-year experience of being in relationship with nature. I get to shed that weight. I think our clients can get to shed that weight. And by being creative, using all of these resources, I think we can do even more wonderful work as coaches and supervisors by using nature as our teacher, actually.
That's lovely. What a lovely quote Jackee, you've given me so much in this conversation today to go and reflect upon myself. Just to wrap up then, Jackee, very quickly, I would love to ask you what has inspired you in the last 7 days?
Oh, last Sunday, I was out near Regent's Park with my daughter. We spent the day together and I came back home about 6 o'clock. The sun was still shining brightly and I stepped out into my back garden. In my back garden, I've got this huge, massive weeping willow tree that covers half of the garden and I have loads and loads of plants. And of course, it was a scorching hot day and some of the plants were looking pretty not in good shape. I looked at one plant, I thought, oh, you know what? I think you need to do a bit of pruning here. So I sat, took out all the dried leaves, clip. And then 2 hours later, 8 o'clock, I was still there. I literally did that to every single plant in my back garden. And I could literally feel myself sinking into a peaceful, calmful, really grateful place. I couldn't describe it. It was just like this sea of calm just arrived inside of me. I had this amazing Calitha plant that used to be in my bedroom. It was so big and so bodacious and it got pests and I couldn't get rid of the pests. So it's been sitting in the back garden for over 3 weeks. And I looked at it on Sunday and I thought, you know what? I'm going to have to cut it. I'm going to have to cut off every single leaf because I could see it wasn't healing. It wasn't growing. And it was quite painful to do it, but I did it. What happened when I came out the next morning? One new leaf had budded. And I thought, that's the power of nature, isn't it? Always teaching us, always showing us. And I was just so grateful for that moment to be in my garden, to lose those 2 hours, to come home to myself. Yeah, that's what really moved me.
I love that. That's such an inspirational image you've just offered us there, Jackee, about the power of nature and this sense of coming home.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful conversation. I can't believe how much we've covered in the short amount of time that we've had available today. 2 more questions very quickly then I'd love to ask you, Jackee. One is about, you've mentioned a number of resources in our conversation today. Are there any other resources that you feel would be important to point somebody who's only just beginning their journey with coaching outdoors on today?
Yeah, I would definitely like to recommend a book called A Well-Gardened Mind by Sue Stewart-Smith. It's one of the most informative books about nature. And I'll tell you what I love about Sue is she's quoted all of the research that I've just known. I'm a geek. I will, anything to do with nature, anything to do with journal writing, I'll just search it, I'll research it, I'll have it there in my resource book, but I haven't put this all together in one place. She does that really well in that book. And what I think it does, it gives coaches and supervisors the confidence to know that this is real work and that it is impactful work and that it is work that is evidence-based and it is work that is legitimate for us to be doing with our clients. In fact, I'm finding that this is most of the work that I'm getting to do with my clients and it's having just such a great impact. If you want a book around journal writing or journal coaching, that's also got a lot of coaching exercises in there. I'd recommend my book, 49 Ways to Write Yourself Well. It's got 49 exercises in there and you can pull out any of those, even though I'm writing a new one because that was written, I think we published that in 2013. So it's well overdue for a new resource. So that will be coming soon. And then I would highly recommend my little pocket maps. How can I forget these? The writing maps. These are 12 illustrated writing prompts that are all nature inspired. One of these maps is called Rewilding the Page. And this is good if you're coaching outdoors because I want you to get a little zip wallet that you have a pencil, a gel pen, a little pocket map, a few little pieces of paper. Just have a little walking and writing kit, I call them. And I did this pocket size and writing maps were perfect for these because they're easy to carry. They're illustrated and they really stimulate your thoughts. And they've got just 12 nature prompts on there. And that's a really good way to get writing. And then finally, the inner and outer nature self-discovery card deck. People love these. You've got 49 journal prompts in there. Really, really simple, nothing complicated. A really good way to warm up a coaching session, a supervision session. You can use them to just do a bit of journaling. You don't need to journal for more than 3 to 4 minutes for each of the prompts. And it's amazing where people go with the prompts, and they bring in an element of surprise. They get people to reflect more deeply, more meaningfully. You can have fun with them as well. You get people to be creative and get connected to their creativity. So those are some resources from me that I think will well resource our community here.
That's brilliant, Jackee. And that leads me very neatly into my final question today, which is how can our listener connect with you, Jackee, and learn more about and find some of these resources that you describe?
So my most go-to social media platform is Instagram. You can find me at Jackee, which is spelled Jackee, Holder, Holder, Inspires. So it's Jackee Holder Inspires. That's me on Instagram. A lot of people follow me on LinkedIn. I don't post there as often, but people message me a lot there. So that's where you can find out things that I'm up to as well in terms of some of the more coaching, supervision work. And I'm on LinkedIn at Jackee Holder. And that's I'll just say Jackee, and then my surname Holder. And on Tuesday mornings, for any women that's listening to the podcast and you want a space where you can be creative with a community of women, I co-host a free co-writing space for any woman who wants to be in a writing space with other women writers. You don't have to be published. You just need to want to come and engage in a couple of writing prompts, a grounding, and then you have space to work on whatever you want for 45 minutes. And then we have a 15-minute closing at the end. That happens every Tuesday morning, UK time, 7 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. And it's co-hosted with my wonderful, beautiful friend, Fiona Parashaw. And I'd like to recommend her book as well, because this is, again, a nature-inspired book, a beautiful way to coach. So that's Tuesday mornings and it's free.
Jackee, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing those connection tips and additional resources there. It's been a wonderfully rich conversation with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rob. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop and increase your coaching expertise.